So the subject is the employment possibilities and sustainability against the post-COVID economic outlook. This is a title Marco gave to me, and I thought it was a very important one because the global COVID pandemic is plunging the world into a socio-economic and financial crisis of unprecedented scale, in addition to the acute health crisis. These are statements from a report of the Committee for Development Policies of the United Nations, of which I'm a member, and which are being discussed by the high-level panel in New York in the General Assembly. And we made a report, and some of the outcome of that is that we observed that many of the gains achieved in the banner of the Sustainable Development Goals are under threat, and that this crisis has exposed and exacerbated vulnerabilities and inequalities in both developing and developed countries, deepening poverty and exclusion, and pushing the most vulnerable even further behind. There's a lot of statistics in the report and other reports, but I'll pass by those. Now, how far, before we ask what is the outcome of the COVID on the achievement of SDG 8 and SDG 10, SDG 8 full employment, SDG 10 reducing inequality, is how far were they being implemented? And I want, in the context of inequality, to be remembered that the target of the goal 10 is actually very weak. Some of you working with the goal can probably relate with that. The goal 10 says only by 2013 progressively achieve and sustain the growth of the bottom 40% of the population at a rate higher than the national average. And that target was a political outcome because some countries in the UN didn't want to actually a multilateral approach to inequality. They said inequality is something national, international bodies should not deal with it. And so this was the compromise. There was a plea by about 120, 130 scholars actually to use the Palmer ratio as an indicator to measure the progress of inequality. And the Palmer ratio is a very easy ratio, very easy to understand. It's the share of the top 10% income earners divided by the share in the bottom 40. And the interesting thing of the Palmer ratio is that it gives also an indication of how the incomes on the top are related, because the goal for the United Nations is a very weak goal. It only looks at the bottom 40% at poverty. So in most evaluations, actually, we go further than the goal, the ILO, my outfit, CDP, and we're using the Palmer ratio or the Gini ratio, which I think you're all familiar with, ranging from 0 to 1. How far were the SDG 8 and 10 implemented? In the report of the Committee for Development Policy, we observed that progress on creating employment and decent work in the decade 2010-2019 had already been limited. And the United Nations observed already in 2019 that at the global level, falling unemployment in developed economies over recent years had been largely offset by rising unemployment in several large upper and middle income countries, which have been deeply impacted by political and economic crisis, inequalities, and continuous socio-economic balance. So the balance sheet was not perfect when the COVID crisis about. But see we, for example, about inequality, that from this table, the important point to take away is that we see rising inequality from 1990 to 2016, and that 70 to 71% of the world population lives in a country in a situation where inequality has increased. We see some regional variations, but still there is a tendency of greater or larger inequality. Now, another point also in evaluating this is which groups gained and lost. And this is an important graph. It's first developed by Branko Milanovic, and this is taken from a report from Gallagher and Colser-Wright on how the real income growth was over the period 1980-2016 of the whole world population. And then we see that with the bottom 30 percentiles, we see that their real income has increased a lot. And that's the rising of the emerging countries. And then if we move higher up to the incomes earners, we see actually that the squeezed bottom in the US and Western Europe. So the US and Western Europe is actually losing out against both the poorest countries and poorest groups, and as you see, which is really scandalous, is the prosperity of the global 1%. The global 1% mainly lives in the industrialized countries, a little bit in developing countries, but we see this huge increase of real income. If you look at the graph of the 99%, and this is something which I will develop also later. The top 1% captured 27% of total growth, and the bottom 50% captured 12% of total growth. So we see already a hollowing out of the middle class. And one of the reasons of the falling income growth and greater inequality in the developed countries and European countries is that there's a definite decline in labor income share compared to capital income share. And this, we call this the crocodile graph. You see that the top 2,000 transnational corporations profit and compared to the labor income share. And you see that the share of the transnational profit is increasing and that of the labor income share is declining since 1995. And you see very much this widening gap. And if we look at regions, and that's also interesting for our discussion on the European level, to which I focus partly in my presentation. If you look at the change in labor income share and income inequality for the different regions, if you look at the third column, where you see Europe and Central Asia, you see that the labor income share in Europe declined most compared to the rest of the countries, with the exception of Latin America. And also in Europe, the income inequality changed, which was different in Latin America. But you see that especially the wage share, the increase in the inequality in the wage share in Central Europe was very large. And I think this is a point we have also to come back later on. Now, but what are the historical patterns of the growing and declining of growing inequality now, and how can we compare that what happened in the past? We don't have time to develop that, but we are in a situation of technological change. The economy 0.4 is called. And if you look in the past, this is figures from my friend Perez, we see that you had, when there were technological changes, always initially an increase in inequality. But then, because of societal reasons, for other reasons, we actually see also turning points that inequality goes down again. And we had that several times in history. Last time where we had this change was in the Roaring '20s, the crash of Wall Street, and then we had a post-war golden age. Some of you spoke already about that, and that has been undone by the fifth wave, the dot-com boom, global casino, and we have sustainable growth, global ICT golden age. Will we have it? And I think the jury is still out on that. So it's still the shock to the system because of the dot-com bubble, technology, etc., is putting the system and the governance questions related to that is that we don't see yet what we saw in other waves, a return to a more equal society. And we can say that actually we are now in the parallels of the end 30s compared to now. So the current technical wave has not yet generated sufficient social forces to achieve greater income inequality as in other periods. And now this is exacerbated by the COVID situation. I'll give some, yesterday I had already some issues on that, but this is an interesting graph from the OECD employment report. If you look at the quartile, lowest quartile and the highest quartile of workers, you see that the highest quartile workers are often work from home, and low income earning often had to stop working. And that has definitely increased the inequality. You see the share of, in the highest quartile from different countries in Europe, compared to the US, many people working at home. In the lowest quartile, very little, and stopped working also. The share of those who stopped working is greater. So this contributes to an increase again in inequality, which was already unequal because of this technological change and the lack of societal reaction to that. Here's another graph, table from the International Labour Organization, where you also see the impact of the crisis on economic output. And we see that in often industries where low-skilled workers were, also retail trade, manufacturing, food and services, arts and entertainment, transport, impact of the crisis on economic output was very high. Now, what can be the possible outcomes of this COVID scenario? And there are discussions about scenarios. At the moment, we had a situation of business as usual in Europe and in the northern countries. Another possible scenario would be that Europe is going in the form of a more oppressive economy like China, with lots of state control, no place for trade unions, but we have to manage the crisis. And another possible scenario is also what we may call digital serfdom, where let's say the Zuckerbergs and the others of the world with their technology will do good for the world. And you see tendencies in certain circles of that, that those companies are getting so large, they get into the political discussion and they think they can save the world. But I think those three scenarios, business as usual, China light and digital service, will not solve the greater inequality problem. And there's actually, and now we have to go back again to what I mentioned after the Second World War, to a situation which we can call maybe welfare state number 3. Welfare state number 1 was the situation after the Second World War, where between social partners, an acceptance that the society needed to be rebuilt, and the welfare state was strengthened and created. And one of the corollaries actually of that Second World War consensus was that it was the only time actually where you saw rising in declining inequality with very large growth rates. And I think that is something which we have to take better to heart, that there are situations, if there is consensus, you can achieve decline in inequality and also have very high growth rates. So something should be done. My colleague Matsukato stated recently that the COVID crisis is an opportunity to reevaluate how public and private sectors collaborate to shape a better kind of capitalism. And this is the time to walk the talk on stakeholder capitalism, and direct dialogue with trade unions and other civil organizations should provide social support. We had in the previous session already a discussion on that. In the COVID-19 pandemic, governments have the upper hand for the first time in a generation. They should use this to renew their economies and society in a just and sustainable direction, and to ensure that the resilience that will be necessary against future crises. COVID-19 will not be the last. So, and I think that's also why this conference is very appropriate. there is at the moment, and we saw that yesterday also in the presentation of the surveys, an acceptance by a large part of the population that the government should play a greater role. There is the corollary, of course, that the government is often not well trusted, but the notion that there should be a societal response has gained much more traction. So that's something I think which should be worked on. It's a bit of a cliche to say the crisis and opportunity. I don't like to say that actually, but there is political momentum, and I think we need to construct and strengthen this political momentum. That's what I mentioned already. The post-World War II consensus and social contract can be seen as a possible model. Some analysts have labeled that period the golden age. The willingness to set economic and social goals and to adhere to these goals contributed. And what was remarkable actually after the Second World War, at that time, research actually indicated that greater inequality could be good for growth. So there were really, after the Second World War, not yet the research finding that you have now that greater inequality actually is damping growth. But even at that time, when it was accepted intellectually by most people, not all, that greater inequality would reduce growth, there were still two goals: reduce inequality and create economic growth. And that was accepted as a societal growth. That was actually then destroyed, we discussed that yesterday already, in the Reagan-Thatcher period, that's actually the social model too. And so the plea is now to take elements of this post-world, Second World consensus to build a new economic and social context. One of those issues which we discussed already is the distribution of disposable income. And I just show you here a graph from a report from Palma. We compare Germany and Korea. And you see that the D stands for the deciles, that both in Germany and Korea, about the deciles 5 to 9, they have 55% of national income, and that the highest decile has around 23% of income. The Gini ratio is 32, so very equal societies in terms of disposable income. That is what the consumers get, what the households get when they want to spend. But, and this is something important, what about market income? And if you look, Korea and Germany had the same kind of disposable income. But if you see the difference in the inequality between market income, which is the blue line in the German and the Korea sample, and the disposable income, you see that the market income inequality has increased tremendously in Germany, and the disposable income inequality also a bit. But the corollary of that is that Germany had to set up, and that is for most European countries, a much larger distribution mechanism to tame that larger increase in market income to keep at least some social welfare going. But it became much more difficult. They had to distribute more to keep the system going. And some of that distributional, the need to redistribute because the market income inequality is so big, aid also in the role of the government in serving technology, etc. And here you look at the situation in Korea. In Korea, you see that the market income inequality went a little bit up, but not much, in the disposable income inequality also. But the bandwidth remained the same. And so this is posing a lot of European countries now for problems because they have to distribute much more from market income in order to keep the welfare state going, or the decline in the welfare state. And we see also in other countries, in Latin America, also the difference is lower. And so one of the issues, the corollary of that is, and we discussed that yesterday already, is that we have seen that there is a much growing difference between labor productivity and wages. This is from the ILO report in the developed countries. You see that the wage index is lagging enormously behind the labor productivity index. And so that means that the market income becomes much more unequally distributed than it was in the past. And so this is the challenge, which needs consensus and also interventions by social partners to level the wage index again with the labor productivity index in order to reduce that balance in market income. Because the governments in Europe have to distribute so much, they have to either raise taxes or they have to get debt. Well, here you see another growing inequality of market income and has not led to changes in higher investment. And that's the second point, that although the market income has increased, investment in Europe has not increased. So there's really a roaming off on the top level, which is not going to fruitful investment. So in order to protect, I mentioned that already, disposable income, European governments need to tax more or to borrow and increase government debt. And taxation is shifting from corporate tax to income tax with lower marginal income tax rates. And it means that the middle classes are put under pressure by the tax system. And that is really an issue, we touched about it yesterday, we can discuss it today, which leads to dissatisfaction of the middle classes with the current system. They feel that the burden is all on them. And the children will not be as rich anymore, have income as their parents. And so we have to take away that burden from the middle class in order to reach larger consensus on social policies. Here you see an interesting picture of the share of corporate taxes declining. And you see that in all countries in the world, in between 1980 and 2012, the share of corporate taxes has declined. In some countries, tremendously, in other countries, a little bit, but it is almost unbelievable to see that there has been this international move to reduce corporate income tax, which means that personal income tax had to increase in order to keep the tax level up. Again, pressure on the middle classes. And so in order to rebalance this inequality, we have to look at revamping the tax system in order to relieve the middle classes from the burden on them. From other UNDP report, in countries of the OECD, top income tax rates fell from 66% in 1981 to 40% in 2018. So also the pressure of the middle income classes is not only because the wages are suppressed, but also that the top income taxpayers are paying less taxes because the marginal tax rate has gone down. So that's another thing which needs to be done. Now, to come to the point of global warming, the recent UN social report has an interesting corollary. They say that the ratio between the income of the richest and the poorest 10% of the global population is 25% larger than it would be in a world without global warming. I don't go into details. It relates to where the poorest population in the world is located, their resilience to climate change, etc. But it is important also that global warming is not only a goal in itself, but is also reducing global warming can contribute to greater equality, which can then contribute to better consensus on policies. And so we need to move to a situation of greening, equality, investment, and decent work. And this is some work we used with Roderick and his collaborators. Economic insecurity and inequality today are structural problems. Secular trends in technology and globalization are hollowing out the middle of the employment distribution. This results in more bad jobs and permanently depressed labor markets outside metropolitan centers where high-tech jobs are available. And addressing these problems requires a different strategy that tackles the creation of good jobs directly. The onus should be on firms to internalize the economic and social spillover they cause. Hence, the productive sector must be at the heart of a new strategy. The decline in workers' bargaining power in recent decades points to the need for new forms of social dialogue and cooperation between employers and employees. Better designed progressive taxes must also be introduced to address widening income inequality. Anti-monopoly policies must be reinvigorated. We all know what the European Commission tries to do at the moment with tech firms to ensure greater competition, particularly where social media platforms and new technology are concerned. And climate change must be tackled head-on. Governments must play a bigger role in fostering new digital and green technology. So, seize the moment. Critically, now is the time for the Green Deals being shaped across the world to be put in action as the Green Renewal Strategy. The twin challenges of recovery from the coronavirus economic shock and just transition to a low-carbon economy are why a healthy Green Deal is so essential as the direction for COVID-19 economic renewal. These are not separate challenges, as I indicated, but deeply interlinked. And our response to COVID-19 will shape our resilience to the impending climate emergency. COVID-19 has prompted a bold state response, and to be successful, a healthy Green Deal will require a rethink on similar scale on how governments can negotiate with business and shape the future course of development. Thank you very much.
How to tackle income inequalities?
I would also like to thank you, Professor Verhoeven, for the extremely stimulating presentation. I found not just your analysis extremely useful and really sharp and crisp, but also some of your suggestions extremely thought-provoking. And I could sense, obviously, that you are a fan of the idea of a welfare state Mark III. And I think clearly that's a very promising idea. And as I hope you will allow me as a discussant in this session to perhaps elaborate a bit more on the challenges of this very good, strong idea for the welfare state Mark III. And I will do this in three parts very briefly, if I may. Obviously, what one gets from your presentation in a very clear way is that, of course, growing inequalities call for solutions, and those solutions inevitably bring into question the idea of redistribution. So that's my first point. The second point is, what kind of redistribution? How do we achieve this redistribution? And it's on the second point that I would like to elaborate a bit more. Obviously, welfare states, as we've come to know them after the Second World War in particular, have been a huge exercise in redistribution, typically, but not exclusively, through the state taxing wealth, taxing income, as you're rightly saying, and redistributing the processes of those taxation exercises in order to manage and reduce inequalities. And of course, you've shown that over the years, the ratio, the relationship between taxation over incomes and taxation of wealth has changed dramatically. I think we're now, with the COVID era in particular, but also before, we're entering a phase where, and this is also clear from your presentation, redistribution is not just called upon within the state, but also between states, between populations. And I find this obviously extremely important, but also extremely challenging. And I would like to come up with three reasons why I think redistribution between countries, and in the context of the COVID crisis, we have this big example of the COVID Recovery Fund that's just been agreed. It's a huge redistributive tool in a number of ways that are both new and interesting, but it's challenging. I think the idea of redistribution historically has been linked to the welfare state, but in the context of a state, in the context of a demos. It has, in a way, been the expression of the idea of solidarity, but also an idea of solidarity that is very linked to a demos. And it becomes really challenging to operate redistributive policies beyond the demos. And of course, this is something that we have been trying to do in Europe for some time now. I would say even before COVID, to a certain extent, there was an attempt to engage into some degree of redistributive policy or solidaristic policies after the 2008-2009 crisis, but it came with a big price tag for the beneficiaries of those solidarity programs. And in particular, it came with an accompanying treatment of austerity policies that have really debilitated, to a certain extent, Europe, have actually increased inequalities. And I think they are a testimony of the difficulty of coming up with an idea of redistributive politics and policies between member states in the absence of a strong shared vision of solidarity. And, you know, this solidarity is already fragile at a national level within the demos. And I think we're really struggling to create a genuine sense of solidarity between member states, strong enough to justify genuine redistributive politics. And, you know, when we have these discussions about the COVID recovery fund, we talk about, you know, the frugal states, and then there's the other. In reality, I fear that what we are seeing behind all these labels of frugality, there is a certain resistance to really embracing a strong vision of solidarity, and it's challenging. I recognize that it's difficult to create solidarity between different demos. Historically, it's been difficult. So there is a risk of a backlash. There is a risk that you know, these redistributive policies between, say, some countries and other countries, some populations and other populations, can generate resentment, can generate unhappiness. We try to attach various labels in order to make sure that those at the delivering end of solidarity don't feel that they're being conned in the process. But this generally this is a real challenge for welfare state Mark III, and it's a welfare state Mark III at a national level is important, but is not sufficient. Can we have a welfare state Mark III at a supranational level? Maybe we should, but I think this lack of a strong solidarity bond across different demi is going to be a real problem that we need to confront, and there are no easy solutions. So if this is a problem, and this brings me to my third point, if it is difficult to have redistributive policies in the way we need them, there is no doubt about that. Can we think about something else? And I think this, in a way, brings me to your very acute analysis of the share of wealth that over the years has left labor and moved into corporate gains. So I think that we are neglecting, and we shouldn't be neglecting, we should re-emphasize the important redistributive role that labor law, trade unions, collective agreements have historically played in most Western social democracies, since the title of the conference is about both social and democracy. And I think over the years we've lost focus of the importance of the redistributive vocation that labor law, trade unions have always had and performed in a very sophisticated but effective way, especially since the Second World War, during the golden period that you were referring to. But even before, and even now, they do continue to perform, perhaps in a less effective way because of the tensions that you have highlighted. And I think it is going to be extremely important that in the years to come, we focus our attention on the again, on the redistributive potential of labor law, or to use the expression of Jacob Hacker, on the predistributive potential of labor law. But this will require, I think, two things. First of all, a new concept of work that is attuned to the significant changes that you already alluded to in your presentation, and also a new concept of wealth, so that we can actually identify wealth, the new forms of wealth, of accumulation, and tax them in a way that is both fair and effective.
Is Goal 8 driving the sustainability agenda in a post-COVID-19 scenario?
First of all, thanks for giving us the opportunity and giving me the opportunity to participate in this extraordinary panel. And it's a pleasure also to meet again Professor van der Hoeven, and because we were together last year also in a discussion on SDGs, and in particular SDG 8. So I would like to put my remarks basically in three main arguments. I think that the presentation of Rolf has many points on convergence on actually what is our narrative on an SDG-based recovery. An SDG-based recovery with calling for a new social contract, and which is based, of course, on social dialogue and collective bargaining. The SDGs, of course, are relevant more than ever now in a recovery scenario, as Ursula von der Leyen has also reminded us. And we, as ITUC, have actually developed a monitoring tool specifically on SDG 8 in order to advocate and support the importance of the labor agenda within the SDGs. And SDG 8 being on sustainable and inclusive growth and decent work, of course, is for us of a paramount importance to move forward the sustainability agenda, even more in a pandemic recovery scenario. So these are two slides that I wanted to share with you, because the index or the monitor that we have developed on SDG 8 is actually interlinked with many goals and targets within the Agenda 2030. But especially I wanted to show you how the interaction between SDG 8 and income inequality and poverty are actually featured. So there is a positive correlation between, higher level of achievement of SDG 8 and decreasing of inequality and decreasing of poverty. Then another important point that Rolf made in his presentation is indeed the adequacy and the relevance of the monitoring and indicators within the Agenda 2030. And he referred in particular to Goal 10. Which is on inequality. I mean, we can be more, of course, in agreement with him, because, of course, actually the ITUC together with other civil society organizations are pushing the UN and the Statistics Commission in that sense, because it's the body dealing with that, in order to adopt more relevant indicators when it comes to monitoring and inequality. The Palma ratio is for sure priority on that, but also indicators that can mirror the redistributive impact of fiscal policies, for example. So this is true also not only for SDG 10, but for SDG 8 itself. We still are facing with significant lack of comparable data. in dimension related to, for example, informal economy, social protection, occupational health and safety, and also child labor, amongst others. So it's a very important point that Rolf brought forward and brought ahead, because we need to improve the indicators availability and comparability, especially in developing countries, because otherwise the monitoring and the track process objective will be completely lost. So the second point that I wanted also to underline is that through the SDG-8 monitor, the ITUC SDG-8 monitor, we want to show that there is no trade-off between economic growth rates and also reducing inequality. And this is what I think Rolf was underlying in his intervention. If Marco helps me with the second slide, thank you. We have actually targeted 4 dimensions for the SDG-8. The first one is the economic well-being by income groups, and you see the high income, lower income, the definition in the slide itself. So the first outcomes of the SDG-8 monitor is indeed that growth alone doesn't grant wider well-being for all. You see that higher income countries are distributed also in the lower segment of the histogram. So this is pretty visible. So the second one is Marco, if you can please go ahead. It's on employment quality by income groups. Here we see we don't see so evident anymore the north-south divide, but we see actually that there is a correlation between GNI per capita and employment quality that is weak. So basically, we see that also, I mean, there is a widespread weakness of employment quality across the income the income of the countries. So the third dimension that actually we have measured, Marco, if you go into the next slide, is labor vulnerability. Here, most countries are below the world average, which means that the vulnerability of workers is seen across the region of the world. And then the fourth dimension that we have monitored is the labor rights. Labor rights that and here it's pretty evident that the respect of worker rights is not related to economic performance of the country, because you see high income countries throughout all the spectrum of the histogram. So basically this is also something that goes in the sense that Luca Visentini was actually saying yesterday when he referred that when he mentioned that good actually emergency measure were achieved in countries with strong collective bargaining. So in that sense, we have also the supporting data in that respect. There is also a link between, I think, this respect of labor rights and trade union freedoms to SDG 16 within the Agenda 2030 that should be, which is on governments and strong institutions. That I think it was also very much mentioned, yesterday in the presentation when talking about the competence of governments in dealing with the economic crisis and recovery, that actually is of course related to strong institution, and there is a strong link there. So basically, we deeply agree with the plea to go beyond the GDP, as the only measure, but really to include other elements that can contribute to a real measuring of progress. And in that sense, I would like also to refer that, like the value, for example, to value the concept of public good this is something that was mentioned even this morning. So at the as a third and last point, actually we see that a major challenge of these days is really the governance, not only at national level but also at supranational level, like it was mentioned. And as ITUC, we are trying to to strengthen the global governance that can serve also to provide a global response to the global challenges. So for example, we are participating now at the UN processes. For the first time, we see finance minister conveyed at the UN level, at the United Nations level, which is certainly a very important step forward. And we are calling for basically a recovery based on jobs, on social protection, on just transitions, and this is also, I mean, these were actually very well explained also in the various sessions before. But of course, also taxation is a very much relevant topic, as the crocodile graph of Rolf was actually explaining very well. So in terms of policy option, I would like to suggest three main ones. The first one is an SDG-8 driven recovery. The second one is improving data availability and comparability, because this is at the very basis of governance in that respect and going beyond the GDP. And then the third point is indeed on global governance. We need, Nicola mentioned the supranational welfare state, so the lack of solidarity. So we really need to work at a global level to rethink a global governance can be actually responding to global crisis. I'll stop there. Thank you, Marco.
Thank you, Mr. van der Hoeven, Mr. Contouris, and Ms. Simonetti. What we get from this session is, to face the current crisis, we need a new social contract that builds on SDG-8-driven recovery, that distributes more to low and mid-income households through wages and social transfers. Through social dialogue and collective bargaining, trade unions must enhance their redistributive role of labor law and promote fairer taxation systems in order to reduce market income inequalities, thus redesigning social protection schemes that provide adequate and universal coverage for new needs. Multilateralism and regional and global governance based on solidarity must be strengthened, and data availability and comparability must be improved.